Chapter 1. The girl who fell toward the dark. The bridge had no name worth remembering. It stretched over the Varane River like a scar across pale skin. Old iron. Older stone. The kind of structure that had watched 2 centuries of the desperate and the damned come to stand at its railing and stare down into the black water below. The city of Varane had built newer bridges since, prettier ones with gas lamps and carved balustrades. But this one, the locals called simply the crossing, and they said it in the same tone one uses for churchyards and plague streets. A place where the living sometimes stop being such. Alara Voss had not planned to come here tonight. She had planned to pack one bag, walk to the eastern rail station, and disappear into the countryside before her brother's wedding guests finished their 3rd course of dinner. She had planned to be gone cleanly, quietly, without spectacle. That had always been her gift, or so her mother had told her, with the particular warmth of someone paying a compliment that was actually a command. "You're so good at being invisible, Alara. Don't ruin it now." But the bag had been taken from her room before she could reach it. Her purse confiscated. Her railway ticket, the one she'd saved 3 months of small earnings for, torn in half by her brother Aldrich with a smile that didn't reach his pale eyes. And then the words that followed, spoken before the assembled house staff and half the wedding party, because Aldrich had never believed in private humiliations when public ones left deeper marks. "You'll stay. You'll smile. And when I've secured the Marin alliance, I'll find somewhere quiet to put you where you won't embarrass the family further. Somewhere quiet to put her. As though she were furniture. As though the last 26 years of her life had been a prolonged misplacement, and her brother was simply correcting an error of arrangement. So she had not gone to the rail station. She had walked instead, through the narrow, gaslit streets of Varanemore's old quarter, until her feet brought her to the crossing without her quite deciding to come. And now she stood with her hands gripping the iron railing, the cold October wind pulling her dark hair across her face. The Varane River churning 40 feet below in its autumn fury, swollen and black and indifferent, and somehow the most honest thing she had seen in weeks. She was not, she told herself, going to jump. She was simply standing here because it was the one place in the city where no one would look for her, where she could breathe without someone measuring the quality of that breath and finding it wanting. The church bell somewhere in the city struck 11. Alara closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to be free of it. The house, the name, the careful architecture of smallness her family had built around her for as long as she could remember. The way they had chipped and trimmed and sanded her down until what remained barely held a shape. She leaned forward, just slightly, just to feel the river cold air on her face. She told herself, just to feel something that was real. The railing groaned, old iron, old rot beneath the stone. Her weight slight as it was found the one section of balustrade that 20 years of salt air and neglect had quietly been surrendering to gravity. And it gave without warning, a grinding shriek of metal. And then there was nothing beneath her hands and the world tipped sideways and she was falling. The scream tore out of her before thought could intervene. The river rushed up, black and roaring, and for one hideous, crystalline second, every small tragedy of her life seemed to compress into the single understanding that she had not meant for this. She had not meant for this. And the water was going to be so cold. Something caught her. Not the bridge. Not a rope, or a ledge, or any sensible architecture of salvation. Something caught her the way a hand catches a dropped glass, swift, certain, almost casual in its precision. And the falling stopped so abruptly that the breath slammed back into her lungs and her vision whited out at the edges. She hung suspended above the river, 40 feet of black water still churning below her, and she was held, arms around her. One beneath her knees, one across her back, gripped like carved stone, and exactly as unyielding. She was gasping, trembling, her whole body vibrating with the shock of near death. And she became aware of warmth that was not quite warmth, the suggestion of it, the architecture of it, without the living pulse she would have expected from a human rescuer. She looked up. The man holding her was not standing on anything, he was simply there, suspended in the black air above the Varane River as though gravity were a law that applied to other people, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little light reached them from the distant gas lamps. His face, she could see it clearly despite the dark, which was itself a wrong and impossible thing, was severe and pale and extraordinarily still, the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with age. Deep-set eyes, the color of old garnets, the dark red of dried blood in candlelight, fixed on her face with an expression that was not warm and was not cold and was not anything she had a word for yet. He did not appear to be breathing. He looked at her for a long moment, her tear-streaked face, her bare hands still reflexively grasping at nothing, her absolute terror and the grief underneath it, that was older and quieter and had been there long before the bridge. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and unhurried, carrying no particular surprise. As though he caught falling women above midnight rivers with some regularity. You weren't trying to die, he said. It was not a question. But you weren't entirely certain you minded the possibility. Alara stared at him, which, he continued, beginning to move gliding, really, backward and upward with impossible ease toward the bridge's intact far end, is the most honest thing I've encountered in this city in 11 years. He set her down on solid stone, released her with immediate, deliberate care, stepping back to full paces before she'd even found her footing, as though proximity itself were something he was choosing to ration. He looked at her hands, her feet, her face, assessing damage. She had the unsettling impression of being catalogued. You're uninjured, he said. You were flying, she whispered. Something crossed his face that might, in another century, in another man, have been amusement. No, he said. I was descending. There is a difference. He tilted his head, and the gas lamp light caught his eyes and made them briefly luminous, impossible, ancient. Go home, girl. I don't have one, she said. Before she could stop herself, the silence that followed was the longest she had ever stood inside. No, he said at last. And something in his voice had shifted, not softer, precisely, but deeper, the way a bell sounds different in an empty church. I don't suppose you do. He did not leave. Neither did she. Above them, the October sky was the color of a bruise. Chapter 2. The house at the edge of the quarter he walked, and she followed. She could not have explained the decision with any logic that would satisfy a reasonable person, and she understood that. A stranger had materialized from the air above a midnight river, and caught her before she hit the water. And now he was moving through the narrow back streets of Varenmoor's old quarter with the unhurried certainty of a man who had long since stopped fearing. What? Lived in dark places? Because he was what? Lived in dark places. And she was walking 6 paces behind him, like a stray that hadn't yet been told to leave. What? She could have explained if pressed. Was this? Going back to the Voss house meant Aldrich. It meant the wedding, the guests, the particular smile her brother wore when he had won something. It meant somewhere quiet to put you. And she had stood at the edge of a broken railing 40 feet above a black river, and understood, in the most visceral terms available to the human body, that she was not ready to be put anywhere. So she walked. He did not acknowledge her, following him for 3 full streets. Then, without slowing or turning, he said, You're cold. She was. The October wind had teeth in her dress chosen for an indoor family dinner. Not a midnight escape offered nothing against it. She had been ignoring the shivering through sheer stubbornness. I'm fine, she said. You're lying, he said, in the same neutral tone one might use to note that it was. In fact, Thursday, he turned at the end of a cobblestone lane, and she nearly walked into his back when he stopped before a door. Iron-banded oak, set into a stone facade that had been old before her grandparents were born. The building rose 4 stories into the dark, its upper windows shuttered, its lower ones curtained in heavy black fabric that admitted no light in either direction. No house number, no nameplate, just a door that looked like it had never once in its existence been approached by someone with uncomplicated intentions. He pressed 2 fingers against a small iron plate beside the lock. She heard or felt, she couldn't be certain, a sound below the threshold of normal hearing, a resonance like a bell struck inside stone walls. And then the door opened inward on silent hinges. Come in, he said. Or don't, but you have perhaps for minutes before the temperature drops further. And you're already at the edges of what your body tolerates gracefully. She crossed the threshold. The interior swallowed her. That was the only word for it. Not a gradual adjustment to dim light and enclosed space, but an immediate, enveloping presence, as though the house itself noticed her arrival and was deciding what to make of it. Candles burned in iron holders along the entrance hall, their light warm and gold, and somehow ancient, illuminating walls lined with dark wood paneling and here and there, paintings she did not have enough light to properly see, but which seemed to depict landscapes that did not correspond to any geography she recognized. The air smelled of old paper, candle wax, and something underneath, cold stone. deep earth, and a faint sweetness she could not identify that made the back of her throat tighten in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. He moved through the hall ahead of her with the ease of long familiarity, opening a door to the left into what resolved itself, as her eyes adjusted, into a sitting room. A fireplace, already holding the remnants of a recent fire, its coals still orange-edged and generous with heat. A chair, heavy and high-backed, positioned before it. Books, horizontal and vertical, and stacked in configurations that suggested a reading habit completely indifferent to the organizational opinions of others. He crouched before the fireplace and added wood to it with efficient, economical movements. Within moments the fire had grown, and the room's shadows retreated into the corners where they belonged. He straightened and turned. In the firelight, she could see him more completely than she had on the bridge, and her brain worked quietly through the inventory of wrongness with the methodical calm of shock, the absolute pallor of his skin. Not ill, but inhumanly even, as though the blood beneath had simply decided that circulation was a matter of policy rather than necessity. The stillness that resided in him between movements, not rest, not patience, but genuine suspension, like a clock that only ticked when it chose to. The eyes, dark red in most lights, that occasionally caught the fire and went briefly deeply luminous. Sit, he said. Warm yourself. She sat in the chair because her legs had decided, democratically and without consulting the rest of her, that they were finished standing. The heat from the fire pressed against her hands and face, and she let it, closing her eyes for just a moment, feeling the shaking in her chest begin, slowly, to subside. When she opened her eyes he was standing by the far wall, arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable quality she had noticed on the bridge. Not unkind, not kind, calibrated. What's your name? She asked. A pause. The fire popped. Casimir, he said, as though the word itself was a decision being made in real time. Elara. She paused. Elara Voss. Something moved in his expression at the name, not recognition, she thought, but something adjacent to it. A filing away, careful and complete. You should know, he said quietly, that this house is not safe for someone like you. Someone like me, she repeated. Human, he said, flat, plain, watching her face as he said it. The way one watches for the moment a candle flame first touches paper. Elara looked at the fire. She thought of the broken railing, the black water, the way the air had rushed past her face. She thought of Aldrich's smile and her confiscated ticket and 26 years of being carefully, lovingly made into something small. I'm starting to think, she said, that nowhere is particularly safe for someone like me. Casimir was quiet for a long moment, then he moved to the doorway, paused with his back to her, one hand resting on the frame with a stillness that carried the weight of centuries. There is a room upstairs, he said. The lock is on the inside. I will not come to that floor between midnight and dawn. A breath or something shaped like one. Those are the terms I offer. You may accept or leave. What are you? She whispered. He turned his head slightly. Not enough to show her his face. Just enough to let her know he'd heard. Something old, he said. Something that should have let you fall. He stepped into the hallway. The stairs are to the right. He disappeared into the dark beyond the candles, and the fire settled inside, and Elara Voss sat alone in the oldest room she had ever occupied, and understood, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had already survived one impossible thing tonight, that she was not going to leave. Chapter 3. The habits of the unhuman. She slept better than she had in years. That was the most unsettling thing about the first night in Casimir's house, not the strange resonance she could feel in the walls if she pressed her palm flat against the plaster, not the occasional silence so complete it felt pressurized, not even the distant sound she heard once around 3 in the morning. That might have been movement below, and might have been the house settling, and might have been something else entirely. What unsettled her was how deeply and dreamlessly she slept in the narrow bed behind the locked door, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme, while the October wind pressed itself against the shuttered window like something, trying to remember how to get in. She woke to gray morning light, and the absolute certainty that she was being watched. She was not. The room was empty, the door still locked from the inside, the window latched. But the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of her neck as she dressed in yesterday's clothes and stood before the small mirror above the washstand. An old mirror, slightly foxed at the corners, that showed her a version of herself she barely recognized. Pale, eyes too large. A bruise on her left palm she didn't remember acquiring, shaped like the iron railing of the crossing. She unlocked the door and went downstairs. The sitting room was empty of him. The fire had burned to cold ash. The candles had guttered in the night, and morning turned the room into a different space. Smaller somehow, its shadows less romantic, the stacks of books resolving from mysterious into merely eccentric. She found the kitchen by instinct, a long, stone-floored room at the back of the house that showed signs of occasional, almost performative use. A kettle, a tin of tea, wood stacked beside a small iron stove. No food, she noted. No bread, no fruit, nothing perishable. The single cabinet she opened held only dry goods, tea, salt, a jar of something preserved in dark liquid she chose not to inspect closely. No meat, no eggs, no butter. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what this meant. She was still thinking about it 2 hours later when she found the first evidence. It was, on its own, nothing remarkable. A book left open on the sitting room floor, face down to preserve the page, its cover dark with age. She picked it up because leaving an open book face down felt like a small violence, and turned it to see the title. The text was in a language she didn't recognize. Not French, not Latin, not any alphabet she could name, but tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note in perfect, archaic English that read, "Third revision of blood covenant terms, Varane more accord. 1743. She set the book down carefully. She found the second thing at noon, when a thin bar of sunlight crossed the hallway, and she noticed because she was, by nature and by years of surviving, the Voss household, a woman who observed small things, that the sunlight stopped at a very precise line on the hallway floor. Not the line of a shadow cast by the doorframe, not any architectural explanation she could construct. The light simply went to a certain point and then diffused, scattered, as though something invisible bent it gently, away from the inner rooms. She stood with her toe at the edge of that line for a long moment. Then, she went to the sitting room window and looked out at the street and understood, from the angle of the pale sun, that the diffusion should not have been possible. The third thing she found was him. She had assumed he was simply absent, outgone, somewhere that was not here. But when she climbed to the second floor in search of a bathroom and turned the wrong way in the corridor, the door at the end was fractionally open, and through the gap she could see an edge of heavy curtain in the corner of a bed and the absolute, geological stillness of a man who was not asleep in any way she had ever witnessed sleep. His chest did not rise or fall. She stood in the corridor for a full 30 seconds, cold with a fear that was not quite fear, watching that motionless outline through the gap in the door. His hand was visible, resting on the coverlet, pale, perfectly still. No flutter of pulse at the wrist. She backed away without breathing. She was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a second cup of cold tea, when she heard him. The quality of the house changed. She felt it before she heard anything, a shift in pressure, like a room coming to attention. And then footsteps on the stairs, unhurried and even. And then Casimir was in the kitchen doorway. He looked exactly as he had the night before. Rested was not the word. Reconstituted, perhaps. Whatever suspended state had held him for the daylight hours had released him without residue. And he stood in the kitchen doorway in dark clothing and complete self-possession, and looked at her with those dark garnet eyes that gave nothing away. "You stayed," he said. "You don't breathe. When you sleep," she said. A pause. He moved to the far side of the kitchen and stood with his back against the counter, arms folded, watching her the way he had the night before. That calibrated, weighing attention. "No," he said, "I don't." And the sunlight in the hallway. A ward. Diffusion only, not exclusion. "I'm not restricted to darkness. But direct sunlight is." He paused, selecting the word with care. "Unpleasant, unpleasant," she repeated, intensely. She looked at her cold tea. "The food. There is none. I don't eat," he said. Then, after a measured beat, "Not what you would call food." She had known, in some pre-verbal part of herself, since the bridge. Since the impossible suspension above the river, since the eyes and the stillness and the house that bent light by preference. She had known, and she had been building the knowing carefully, brick by careful brick, the way you approach a large truth that your body needs time to accept. She looked up at him. "Say it plainly." He met her gaze without evasion, which she had not expected. and which cost him something. She could see it, the particular effort of a man who had spent centuries finding plainness unnecessary. I am what the old texts call Noctivaean, he said. What your contemporary literature has reduced inaccurately to the word vampire. His jaw tightened slightly. I am approximately 600 years old. I do not feed without consent. I do not enter homes uninvited. I do not turn mortals without their knowledge, he said. Each statement the way someone reads a list of principles rehearsed, but not untrue. These are not merely my preferences. They are the laws of my house. Alara set down her cup. Your house, she said slowly. House Casimir, he said. One of 4 governing bloodlines of Varanmore. Something entered his expression, old and careful and edged with a warning she had not yet learned to read. And the reason you being in this house presents a complication. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. Because, he said, House Morvain has been watching the crossing for 3 nights. And they saw me catch you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things she did not yet have words for, pressed against the cold kitchen walls, waiting for her to be ready to understand them. She thought she might need more tea. Chapter 4. What grief looks like in the dark house. Morvain. The name sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, heavy and shapeless, for the remainder of that first gray day. Casimir had said nothing more after dropping it into the kitchen. Silence. Had simply straightened from the counter and told her he had matters to attend to in the lower rooms, and that she was free to move through the house as she wished, with the exception of the cellar door, which was locked, and would remain so, and that he would explain the full shape of things that evening. He had not apologized for the delay. She had not asked him to. She spent the afternoon in the sitting room with his books, most of which were beyond her in language or subject, or both, but which told her things simply by existing. Histories of bloodline law, cartographies of a city that looked like Varanmore, but with districts labeled in categories she had no framework for, feeding grounds, accord territories, unclaimed dark, a slim, water-damaged volume that appeared to be a record of binding oaths. Each entry signed in something that was not ink. By the time the light failed and the candles resumed their quiet authority over the room, she had assembled enough understanding to be frightened in a more specific and therefore more manageable way. Casimir appeared at 7 without announcement, which she was already learning was simply how he moved through space. Present, then more present. The transition between absence and arrival happening somewhere below the threshold of normal perception. He had changed his clothing. Same dark palette, different cut, and she noticed, with the observational habit she could not turn off, that the new shirt had a collar that sat higher on the left side, as though covering something. He had brought her food. That was what stopped her. Not the vampire lore or the house politics or the name that sat like a stone in her chest. The tray in his hands, carried with the careful attention of someone performing a task they had researched rather than practiced. Bread, still faintly warm. A wedge of hard cheese, dried fruit and a small pot of something amber that turned out, when she opened it, to be honey. I sent for it, he said, setting the tray on the low table before the fire with a precision that suggested he was aware of how unfamiliar the gesture was, and had decided to be precise rather than casual about it. There is a woman for streets over who provides certain services in exchange for certain considerations. She doesn't ask about the nature of the household. Alara looked at the tray, then at him. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, the way people nod when they are not accustomed to gratitude and find it faintly destabilizing, and moved to his chair. She had already begun thinking of it as his. The high-backed one angled toward the fire and sat in that way he had, completely still, as though settling into stillness was the same as settling into comfort. She ate, and he watched the fire, and for a time neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That surprised her. In the Voss house, silence had always been either weaponized or filled with the performance of filling it, and she had forgotten that quiet between two people could simply be what it appeared to be. Tell me about House Morvain, she said. His jaw moved slightly. Later. Eat first. I can do both. You're doing neither properly. He glanced at her. You've been holding that bread for minutes without taking a bite. Eat. Morvain will still be a problem once you've finished. She ate. He waited with the patience of something that had been waiting for centuries and had developed no particular relationship with urgency. When the tray was half empty, and she had stopped shaking, in the small, hidden way she'd been shaking since the kitchen, he spoke. House Morvain controls the eastern territories of Varain-Mor, he said. They are one of the 4 bloodline houses bound by the Accord of 1743, a treaty governing feeding rights, territorial boundaries, and the treatment of mortals who become entangled in house affairs. His voice was even, instructional, but she was watching his hands where they rested on the chair arms, and she could see, in the firelight, that his fingers had tightened. Morvain has been testing the Accord's boundaries for the last 2 years, encroaching, feeding outside their territories, taking mortals without the consent clauses. Without consent, she repeated quietly. Yes, the word carried weight. He did not elaborate on, but she heard what lived beneath it. And they saw you catch me. They were watching the crossing because they have a practice. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. They encourage despair in mortals, in particular places, at particular hours. A mortal at the edge of a bridge at midnight was considered by Morvain's customs to be abandoned, property, unclaimed, available. The honey on her tongue suddenly tasted like nothing. They were waiting, she said, for someone to fall. Yes, and you. She looked at him. You were also there. Something shifted in his face. Not evasion, the opposite of evasion, which was harder to look at. I patrol the crossing 3 nights a week. For the last 11 years, he turned back to the fire. I am not always in time. The weight of those last 6 words settled over the room like snowfall. She did not ask him to explain them. She understood with the particular comprehension of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to read the grief that adults hid inside neutral sentences. That he was telling her something enormous and calling it small. Who did you lose? She asked. The fire popped. A log shifted. A full minute passed, and she thought he would not answer. And she was preparing to let him have that, his right to the silence, his right to the wound, when he said, very quietly, her name was Soren. She was a mortal my house had taken under formal protection. A scholar, a woman of extraordinary mind. Morvain found her at the crossing on a night I was 1 hour late. His voice did not break. It was more terrible for not breaking. The Accord demands compensation be paid in such cases. Morvain sent a letter of acknowledgement and a cask of very fine wine. Alara set down the bread. I'm sorry, she said, and mended in the full, unperformative way that grief recognizes grief. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Not the assessing catalogue she had grown used to, but something unguarded and undefended, there and gone in the space of a breath, like a window opened and quickly closed against the cold. You don't look away, he said. When things are difficult, most people look away. I was raised by people who required me to look away constantly, she said. I find I've lost the habit. Something unlocked in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, not quite, but the architecture of warmth, the framing that warmth could eventually inhabit if it chose to. Morvain will come for you, he said. You were witnessed at the crossing. Under their customs, you are complicated. A mortal connected to the head of a rival house. I'm not connected to you. He held her gaze steadily. You are in my house. You ate food I sent for. In the language of the houses, yes. You are connected. She absorbed this. So what do we do? He turned back to the fire, and the window closed again, and Casimir of House Casimir was once more the still and ancient thing that had caught her above the river. But she had seen what lived underneath the architecture. She knew it was there now, and knowing changed something. In the room, in the space between them, in the careful way he exhaled before he spoke. We prepare, he said, and you stay close. She thought of Soren, of 11 years of 3 nights a week vigils on a bridge with no name worth remembering. All right, she said. Chapter 5. The war that was already, he read. Letter arrived before dawn. Alara knew it had come, not because she heard anything. The house absorbed sound the way deep water absorbed light, thoroughly and without return, but because she woke at 4 in the morning with the absolute certainty that something had changed in the quality of the air downstairs. A pressure difference. The house, she was learning, had moods, and its current mood was the specific stillness of a held breath. She lay in the dark for 20 minutes, debating with herself, and then pulled on her boots and went down. Casimir was standing in the entrance hall. He had not lit the candles. He stood in the complete dark with a piece of paper in his hands. Heavy paper, black-edged, sealed with something that had left a dark red residue on his fingers when he'd broken it. And he was reading it with the focused stillness of a man translating, not just language but threat. He heard her on the stairs before she reached the bottom. She had accepted, by now, that his hearing operated on entirely different terms than hers and said, without turning, "Go back to bed, Alara." "No," she said, reaching the hallway and lighting the nearest candle herself with the box of matches she'd taken to carrying in her pocket. Preparation, she'd found, was the only form of control available to her in this house. He turned at the light. His expression told her nothing, which she had learned to read as telling her a great deal. He handed her the letter. The handwriting was elaborate and cold, the kind of script that had been taught with a ruler and enforced with cruelty. It read, "To Casimir Aldrich, head of House Casimir, we note the acquisition. The girl was witnessed at the crossing on the night of the 14th, under Morvain's established claim. Her removal constitutes a breach of territorial custom if not rectified within 3 days. Return her to the crossing by midnight, the 17th, unclaimed and unbound. Failure invites escalation. We trust you understand the meaning of that word. House Morvain, by the hand of Lord Riven Morvain." Alara read it twice. Then she looked up, rectified. She said, "Yes, and if you don't rectify it, then Morvain escalates." He took the letter back, folded it with the precise, deliberate care of someone managing their own anger through the imposition of small order, which means, in practical terms, that they begin feeding in Casimir territory, without consent, without the accord clauses. "Mortals in my district will be taken. Some will not be returned." The candle light threw shadows up the walls. Alara stood in the middle of them and felt the full weight of what she had walked into or fallen into. More accurately, pressing down across her shoulders with the particular heaviness of consequences that had begun long before she arrived. "How many people live in your district?" she asked. "Approximately 4,000. In the old quarter and the river streets, 4,000 people. The thought of them, the fishmongers and the bookbinders and the women who hung laundry over the narrow lanes and the children who chalked drawings on the cobblestones, absorbing the cost of her survival made her stomach turn with a cold, specific nausea. "Then send me back," she said. Casimir looked at her with an expression she could not fully name. Not anger, not dismissal, but something close to the feeling of watching someone say something so wrong it was almost impressive. "No," he said, 4,000 people are not your responsibility to sacrifice yourself for." His voice was quiet and completely immovable. "And returning you to the crossing does not end Morvain's expansion. It simply removes one pretext and hands them another." He set the letter on the hall table. "Morvain has been looking for grounds to breach the accord for 2 years. You are not the cause. You are the occasion." She wanted to argue. She recognized, after a moment of wanting it, that he was right, and that being right made it worse rather than better. "Tell me about Lord Riven Morvain," she said instead. Casimir's expression shifted. Something old and dangerous moved through it like weather. "Riven Morvain is 400 years old," he said, leading her back to the sitting room with the air of a man who needed to be doing something purposeful while delivering difficult information. He rebuilt the fire with efficient movements, feeding it from the wood stack until the room's shadows retreated to their proper places. He took the house headship 90 years ago from his sire, which is not done. It violated 3 separate articles of the accord and cost him formal standing for 50 years. He served the censure period and returned to full standing and spent the following decades doing precisely what he wished with the accord's letter, while gutting its spirit. "He sounds like my brother," Alara said. Casimir paused in his stoking of the fire, looked at her sideways. "In several respects, the comparison is accurate. What does he want?" "Beyond me, beyond the pretext." Casimir set the poker down and stood before the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. And she recognized this posture now. It was the one he used when he was about to say something he had been avoiding. "Morvain wants the accord dissolved," he said. "Full dissolution. No feeding territories, no consent clauses, no protections for mortals entangled in house affairs." He turned to face her. "No restrictions of any kind on how houses feed or turn or use mortal lives." The fire crackled. Alara sat with the implications of this settling through her like cold water, finding every crack. "And if the accord dissolves, then Varanmore becomes something other than what it is." He said it plainly, without drama, which was worse than drama would have been. "There are 3 other houses in the city: Casimir, Morvain, Duskan, and the Varith bloodline who are currently neutral. If Morvain breaks the accord publicly and the other houses do not hold the line, the neutrals fall. And then there are simply predators and prey, and 4,000 people in my district who trusted that the old laws meant something. He was quiet for a moment. The fire spoke instead, its ordinary domestic voice, grotesque against the weight of what he'd described. How long have you been holding that line? She asked. He looked at the fire. Since the accord was written, he said. I was in the room when it was signed. I helped draft the consent clauses, a breath that was almost a human breath. I have been holding this particular line for 283 years. She looked at him, this ancient, exhausted, immovable man, in his candlelit house, who patrolled a bridge 3 nights a week, and had not been in time once, and had kept going back and felt something shift in the space between them. Not pity. She understood instinctively that pity would be the wrong currency here. Something steadier, something that recognized, wait, and did not flinch from it. Then we don't. Return me to the crossing, she said. No, he agreed. And we don't let Morvain dissolve the accord. No, so. She folded her hands in her lap with a practicality that surprised even herself. Tell me how we fight back. And this time she met his eyes steadily. Don't edit out the parts you think will frighten me. Casimir studied her for a long moment. Something moved in those dark garnet eyes. Recognition, she thought, or the beginning of it. The particular recognition of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, been asked to put half of it down. Morvain's first move, he said, will come in for nights. And it will not come here. Where then? He looked at her. The crossing, outside, the October dark pressed close against the shuttered windows. And somewhere in the city's eastern quarter, in a house that was the mirror and opposite of this one, something old and merciless was already counting down the hours. Chapter 6. The weight of ancient names. 3 nights before Morvain's move, Casimir began to teach her the rules, not the ones she might have expected. Not how to fight, not how to run, not the geography of escape routes through Varain Moor's old quarter, though those came later. He started with something older and more fundamental, the way you teach a person to swim by first explaining the nature of water. He started with the lore. The Noctivaean did not choose what we are, he said on the first evening of it, sitting opposite her before the fire with a glass of something dark red that she had learned, by now, not to ask about. There is a version of the story your literature prefers: the bite, the turning, the romantic transmission of monstrousness from one person to another. That version is partly true, partly false. The full truth is older and less comfortable. Alara had found a notebook in the sitting room, slim and leather-bound, with half its pages still empty, and she had begun writing in it without asking permission. He had looked at the notebook the first time, and said nothing, which she interpreted as consent. Tell me the full truth, she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning the glass slowly in his hands. In the early centuries of what your historians call the medieval period, there were families' bloodlines who carried a particular inheritance, not a disease, not a curse, despite what the church preferred to record, a condition of being, passed through blood, which altered the fundamental relationship between the body and time. He paused. We age differently. We process differently. We hunger differently. The sunlight sensitivity, the day sleep, the feeding requirements, these are symptoms of a physiology that operates outside the ordinary boundaries of mortal biology. But you were born mortal, she said. It was not a question. Something in the way he spoke about it told her the particular retrospective distance of someone describing a country they had left and could not return to. Yes, he said. I was born in what is now called Romania, in 1401. I was 23 when the change completed itself. It is not instantaneous. It takes several years in those who carry the bloodline inheritance for the full condition to manifest. His jaw tightened slightly. I watched my brother go through it before me. I thought I understood what was coming. Did you? No, simple, unadorned. Understanding the architecture of a thing and inhabiting it are not the same. She wrote, born 1401. Change not a bite in inheritance. Physical, not supernatural. He was someone before this. The houses, she said. How did they form? He set the glass down. Rose, which meant the subject was moving into more difficult territory. She had noticed that he stood when things became harder to say, as though motion managed what stillness could not contain. He moved to the window, keeping his back to the street, arms folded, When there are enough of you, enough Noctivaean in proximity, governance becomes necessary, he said. We are long-lived, which means conflicts between us, left unmanaged, become catastrophic. A grudge between mortals ends within a generation. A grudge between Noctivaean can run for centuries and take entire cities with it. He turned slightly. The houses emerged as a solution. Bloodline affiliations, territorial agreements, formal hierarchies. The Accord of 1743 was not the first such treaty. It was the 8th. Each previous one had failed. What happened to the previous 7? War, he said, of varying duration and devastation. The 6th dissolution took 40 years and reduced 3 European cities till he stopped. Something moved across his face, swift and dark. I was present for several of them. She looked at him, standing in the window, with 600 years of it behind his eyes, and understood suddenly and completely why he had the particular quality of exhaustion she had been observing. Not tiredness, which passed, but the structural fatigue of someone who had cared about the same things for so long that caring had become indistinguishable from the shape of his bones. The blood owns, she said, reading from her notebook. You mentioned them the first night. Soren's notes the book with the revised covenant terms. He turned fully from the window. You found that? It was on the floor. A pause. Yes, the blood oaths are binding contracts between house heads, sealed with an exchange of blood under witness conditions. They are literal, in our physiology, not metaphorical. A blood oath creates a genuine biological imperative. Breaking one causes, he chose the word carefully, significant physical consequences. How significant? Proportional to the severity of the oath's violation. Minor breaches, discomfort, pain. Major breaches have been known to be fatal. He said it plainly, the way someone states the penalty clause of a legal contract. I hold 11 active blood oaths, 3 with Duskin, 2 with the Verith line. The remainder are accord-related, binding all for houses, and Morvain. The word landed between them with its familiar stone weight. Riven Morvain holds the same accord oaths, Casimir said. He has been approaching their boundaries with the precision of a man who understands exactly how far he can stretch a thing before it breaks. His voice was even, but she could hear the old anger in its foundations. Controlled the way deep water is controlled by a dam, not absent, contained. What he is planning for the crossing in 4 nights 3 nights now will not technically breach the oaths. It will violate their spirit absolutely, and their letter not at all. He's clever, she said, extraordinarily. Is he more powerful than you? The question sat in the air. He did not dismiss it or reassure her, which she appreciated more than reassurance would have cost him. In numbers, yes. House Morvain has 11 sworn members within the city. Casimir has 4, including myself. He returned to his chair, and sat with the careful deliberateness that she now recognized as him choosing to be present rather than closed. In age, no. I am older than Riven by 2 centuries. In experience of war, he looked at the fire, also no. He has not seen what I have seen. Is that an advantage? It is a fact. Whether it becomes an advantage depends on the next 3 nights. He looked at her then, direct and undeflected. It also depends on you. She lowered the notebook. On me. Morvain's letter named you specifically, claimed you as abandoned property from the crossing. His eyes held her steadily. Which means they know your name. They have done research. They know you are a Lara Voss, that you are estranged from your family, that you have no formal social connections in the city. Who would raise an alarm at your disappearance? Something hardened in his voice. Not at her. She could feel the direction of it, aim past her at something else. They prepared for you before they sent the letter. That is not the behavior of a house making an opportunistic claim. That is surveillance. The fire crackled. Alara absorbed this. They knew I would be at the crossing, she said slowly. I believe so. How? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was precise and very careful. Your brother's name, Aldrich Voss. He has business interests in the eastern quarter of the city. He paused. Morvain's territory. The room went very still. She thought of the confiscated bag, the torn ticket, the words spoken before the assembled household with Aldrich's particular smile. Somewhere quiet to put you. She thought of how neat it had all been, how efficiently her means of escape had been removed, how thoroughly she had been maneuvered toward the only path remaining, the crossing. Midnight, the broken railing. My brother, she said, and her voice was level in the way that things are level just before they are not. I don't know the full terms of the arrangement, Casimir said. But yes, I believe the bridge was not an accident. Outside, the city was dark and going about its ordinary mortal business. The last of the taverns closing, the night watch making their rounds. 4,000 people in the old quarter, sleeping in the trust that the old laws meant something. Alara closed the notebook, pressed her palm flat against the cover, felt the steadying solidity of it. Tell me, she said quietly, everything you know about what Morvain does with the mortals they take. Casimir looked at her for a long moment. Are you certain? He asked. Tell me, she said again. He told her. She did not look away. Chapter 7. The night they came on the third night, not the fourth. Casimir had predicted the 17th. They came on the 16th, which told him something about Riven Morvain's strategic mind, that he understood the value of arriving before a prepared defense had fully settled into itself, when the readiness was still slightly soft at the edges, still finding its shape. Alara was in the sitting room when the house changed. She felt it first in her sternum, that subsonic resonance she had learned to read like weather, a pressure shift, the walls pulling inward, the candles bending their flames all in the same direction, simultaneously, as though responding to a wind that existed only in whatever dimension the house partially occupied. She was on her feet before she knew she had decided to stand. Casimir came through the hallway, with the controlled velocity of a man who had done this before, moving fast without appearing to rush, which was its own kind of terrifying. He was already different in some quality she couldn't name precisely, the careful social architecture of him stripped back to something older and more elemental. His eyes were darker. His stillness had become a different kind of stillness, the kind that preceded rather than followed action. 3 of them, he said, at the perimeter ward. They'll be through it in minutes. It was designed for deterrence, not siege. How many do we have? Myself, my second, Petra, she's 2 streets over. I've sent the signal. She'll be here in 10 minutes. He was moving as he spoke, opening a chest in the corner of the room she had assumed was decorative and revealing she blinked an arrangement of objects she would not have classified as weapons until this moment, though in context they resolved immediately. Iron rods sealed at both ends with dark wax, glass vials of something luminous and faintly blue, lengths of heavy chain etched with the same script she'd seen in the Covenant book. What are those? She said, pointing at the vials. Distilled dawn water, he said, handing her 4 without apparent hesitation. Sunlight processed through a mineral solution and concentrated. It won't stop them, but contact causes significant pain and disorientation. Throw it at faces. He met her eyes briefly. Don't miss. She pocketed the vials with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. The iron rods? You cannot use those safely. Stay away from the iron. He took the rods himself, tucking them with practiced efficiency into the inner lining of his coat, which she now noticed was heavier than its cut suggested. Reinforced, perhaps. She filed this away in the part of her mind that had been cataloging him since the bridge, and had by now assembled a substantial volume. Casimir. She caught his arm as he turned. He stopped immediately. She noted it. How completely he stopped when she made physical contact. How carefully his attention arrived. They knew I'd be at the crossing. Which means they were watching me before I came here. Which means they know the layout of the street, he finished. Yes, I've been accounting for that. The back cellar window, she said. The one that faces the alley. The ward diffusion is weaker there. I noticed it 2 days ago. The light comes through differently. He went very still. Not his ordinary stillness. This was the stillness of genuine surprise, which, she was learning, was an extraordinarily rare thing on his face. You notice the ward variance, he said. I notice things, she said. What does it mean? It means that is where they'll enter. He looked at her with that new expression, the one that wasn't quite warm yet but had stopped pretending it couldn't become warm. Come with me. The cellar door, the one that had been locked since her first morning, was unlocked now. He took the stairs quickly, and she followed with one hand on the stone wall, the candle she'd grabbed, doing very little against the quality of darkness that waited below. The cellar was large, low-ceilinged, smelling of cold earth and something mineral and old. Along the far wall, the narrow window set at ground level showed the faintest gray outline of the alley beyond, and she could see immediately what she had identified from the outside. The ward light diffused normally everywhere else in the room, but at that window it arrived clean and direct, a weakness in the net. She looked at the space. Stone floor, stone walls, wooden shelving along one side holding objects she didn't examine. Low ceiling crossed by wooden beams. A single support column in the center, old oak. Dark with age, her mind moved the way it always moved when presented with a problem and no obvious solution. Not toward the dramatic but toward the practical. The small, the things that were already present. The shelving, she said. If we brace it against the window wall at an angle here, and here anyone coming through that window drops into a confined corridor rather than an open room, it limits how many can come through effectively at once, and forces them to move in a single file. He looked at the shelving, looked at the window, looked at her. Yes, he said simply, and they moved together. They worked fast, and in a silence that was not tense, but focused. The shelving units heavy enough that she needed both hands and her full weight, and he moved them with the matter-of-fact ease of something that had long ago stopped pretending that physics applied to it unconditionally. Within 4 minutes they had constructed a channel narrow-angled, exposing anyone climbing through the window to a confined space where they could only come 2 at a time, maximum, before the shelving forced them to slow and redirect. Dawn water vials, Casimir said. Position yourself on the stairs. High ground. Throw from elevation, it increases the dispersal radius. And you? I will be at the base of the stairs. He paused. A fractional pause, but she had learned to read his fractions. Behind you. That's a defensive position, she said. You're protecting me instead of leading the fight. I am doing both, he said. In a tone that ended the conversation, she climbed to the 3rd step from the bottom and gripped the vials in her left hand, her right, holding the candle until he took it from her without asking and extinguished it with 2 fingers. Darkness. She could hear him breathing, or not breathing. The performance of it he sometimes offered as accommodation to her human nervous system. The steady, invented rhythm of a chest moving with deliberate patience. Casimir, she whispered. Yes, if something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. But if it does, a pause in the dark, then I will handle it. That's not what I was going to ask. She steadied her grip on the vials. I was going to ask if something goes wrong. Do you want me to run or stay? Silence. The long-waited kind. Stay, he said. And the word came out differently than anything else he had said to her. Not considered, not strategic, not the careful output of 6 centuries of deliberate speech. Just the word, immediate and unguarded, dropped from somewhere underneath all of that into the dark between them. She had no time to examine what it meant. The window exploded inward. They came fast to figures, moving with the inhuman fluidity she now recognized as characteristic, dropping through the channel into the narrow corridor the shelving had made. The first one hit the rearranged space and faltered exactly as she had predicted, momentum disrupted, forced to slow and angle sideways. She threw. The first vial caught the lead figure full across the face. The sound that followed was not a scream, it was worse than a scream, lower and more fundamental. The sound of something experiencing pain it hadn't anticipated and didn't have a prepared response for. The second figure was already pressing forward, and she threw again. And this time her aim was slightly off and caught a shoulder rather than a face. But the effect was sufficient. Recoil, disorientation. The tight channel doing exactly what she'd designed it to do. Then Casimir moved. She had not seen him fight before. She had understood intellectually what he was, what 600 years of survival meant in practical physical terms, but the understanding had been abstract until this moment. He moved through the dark like dark moves through dark, not visible so much as the absence of visibility, purposeful and absolute. And the sounds that followed were brief and functional, and she did not need to see them clearly to know that they were decisive. The third figure came through the window, and stopped. She could not see why, but she heard it, a voice, low and cold and carrying the particular authority of something that was old when most of the current world was young. Tell Riven, Casimir said, that the girl is under formal house Casimir protection. Tell him I am filing the oath claim at dawn. Tell him a pause, during which the silence had a texture she could feel on her skin, that I remember the 6th dissolution. I was there for all 40 years of it, and I am considerably more patient than he is. A long moment. Then the sound of retreat through the window. Feet on the alley stones, fading. Casimir came to the base of the stairs. She could see the outline of him in the residual dark, and she was aware abruptly and entirely of how close he was standing. Are you hurt? He said. No, she realized her hands were shaking now, the delayed arrival of adrenaline. Are you? A pause. The first one had iron, a small wound. It will close. Let me see it. Alara, let me see it, she said, in the same tone he used when he said stay. He did not argue. She did not let herself think yet about what that meant. Chapter 8. What the wound Aloued the wound was on his left side. She had suspected as much from the way he held himself climbing the cellar stairs. Not heavily, not dramatically, but with the small asymmetry of someone compensating for a specific point of pain and doing it well enough that most observers would miss it entirely. She had not missed it. She was beginning to think she was constitutionally incapable of missing things about him, which was its own kind of problem she had set aside in a corner of her mind to examine later, when survival permitted leisure. He sat where she directed him, the kitchen table. The good light without argument, which told her the wound was more significant than the neutral tone he'd used to describe it. Casimir did not comply with directions easily. Compliance meant something was overriding his default resistance, and pain was the most likely candidate. He removed his coat. The shirt beneath was dark enough that the blood didn't immediately show. But when he peeled the fabric back from his side with the matter-of-fact economy of someone accustomed to assessing their own damage without flinching, she could see it, a gash perhaps 4 inches long, starting below his ribs and angling upward. The edges clean in the way that iron-made wounds apparently were. Not ragged, but precise and refusing to close. Iron disrupts the healing, he said, watching her examine it with the expression of a man who had accepted medical attention from field surgeons in several historical centuries and found the experience universally undignified. How long to heal without treatment? Hours, perhaps more. A pause. It is not a serious wound by my standards. It's bleeding, she said. By my standards, that qualifies. She had already moved to the cabinet under the kitchen counter, where she had located 2 days ago, during one of her systematic explorations of the house, a box that held unexpectedly and with no explanation from its owner clean linen strips, a brown glass bottle of something antiseptic smelling, and a small sewing kit. She had not asked about it. She was asking about it now by using it, which seemed more efficient. Petra should be here, he said, as she brought the box to the table. Petra is not here, and you're bleeding. Hold still. He held still. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound with the antiseptic. He made no sound at the contact, though. She could feel through her fingertips on his ribs the sharp involuntary tension of controlled pain, and then closing the worst of the gap with the needle and thread, while the candle on the table burned low and the house settled back into its ordinary nighttime register around them. The sounds of the street returning to normal. The October wind finding the eaves again. She was 3 sutures, and when she became fully aware of the silence between them, not uncomfortable. The opposite. The kind of silence that had weight and presence and was composed. She was increasingly aware of things neither of them were saying, but that were nevertheless entirely present in the kitchen with them, occupying the space between her hands, on his skin and his eyes on the middle distance, and the slow, careful breath he was maintaining with the deliberateness of a man who had decided that this was the appropriate amount of control for the current situation. You said oath claim, she said, because it was a safe thing to say, and the unsafe things were crowding at the edges. In the cellar. You said you were filing an oath claim at dawn. Yes. His voice was careful. What does that mean? In specific terms. A pause during which she made the 4th suture, and he absorbed it without visible reaction. A formal oath claim means I register your presence in my house with the Accord authorities. It creates a legal record that you are here under Casimir protection, which means any action taken against you by another house constitutes a direct breach of the Accord, rather than a territorial dispute. He paused again. It offers you significantly better protection. She tied off the 4th suture. And what does it cost you? The silence this time had a different texture. She looked up from her work and found him watching her with that unguarded expression she had learned to look for. The window briefly open. It formally aligns you with my house, he said, which means the conflict between Casimir and Morvain stops being about territorial custom and becomes a matter of full Accord law. Riven cannot move against you without moving against every article of the treaty he's been carefully avoiding breaking. He met her eyes steadily. It escalates things. It escalates things for you, she said. Not just for me. Yes, you were going to do it anyway. Without asking me, I was going to explain it to you, and then do it with your understanding, he said, which was not quite the same as saying she was wrong. She looked at him for a moment. The wound, the careful posture, the controlled breath. The man who had patrolled a bridge for 11 years and filed formal oaths in the dark hours after a fight and described it all in the neutral tone of administrative procedure because that was apparently how he managed caring about things. You're protecting me, she said. The same way you tried to protect Soren. Something moved through his expression, swift and deep, like a current below water that barely disturbs the surface. That comparison, he started. I'm not criticizing it, she said. I'm naming it. She tied the final suture, set the needle down, and did not immediately move her hands away from his side, which was a choice she made without quite deciding to make it. There's a difference between being put somewhere quiet and being protected. I'm not confused about which this is. He looked at her hands, then at her face. Soren trusted me, he said quietly, and I failed that trust in the most absolute way available. You were an hour late, she said. That isn't the same as failing. In the result, it is identical. In the result, yes. In the meaning, no. She withdrew her hands, then began refolding the clean linen, giving him space and herself the structural business of tidying as a way of managing the thing that was happening in the kitchen. You've been punishing yourself with that bridge for 11 years. He said nothing. Casimir. Yes, I'm not her, she said. I don't need you to save me from what already happened. I need, she paused, finding the word, the specific true word, a partner. For what's coming. The candle between them had burned to its final inch. Its light was low and warm, and very honest. And in it, she watched something happen in his face that she thought might not have happened there in a very long time. Not the window opening, but the wall behind the window, the thing he kept behind. Even that, showing its edge, the oath claim, he said at last. You understand what it means to be formally affiliated with my house. In the language of the Accord, it means Morvain has to come through you to reach me, she said. Yes, it means more than that. He said it quietly, without drama, in the voice he used for things that were simply true and required no amplification. In Accord law, a formal protection claim carries blood weight. It is not a blood oath, but it is adjacent to one. He met her eyes. It means I am responsible for your life with the same legal gravity that I am responsible for the lives of my sworn house members. The kitchen held this between them, and if I die, she said steadily, under your protection, the consequences would be. He stopped. Significant, she said, using his word from the previous night. A week ago, it would have been irony. Now it was something else. Yes, he said. She absorbed this. The fire had gone low. The October wind was finding new places in the eaves to worry at. And somewhere in the city, Petra was presumably making her way through the dark streets, having missed the entire cellar engagement. And Riven Morvain was reading a message from his retreating soldiers. And the Accord was balanced on whatever decision got made in the next few minutes in this small kitchen. She thought of her brother's smile. The torn ticket. Somewhere quiet to put you. She thought of the weight of Casimir's 11 years at the crossing. The weight of the blood weight he was describing. The weight of the window that had opened and closed and opened again in his face across the past 6 days. File the oath claim, she said. His exhale was not quite human. But it was real. There is one more thing, he said. Tell me. The filing requires a witness declaration, he said, before 2 members of the Accord authority. It requires me to speak your name and formally bind my house's safety to yours. He paused. It requires your presence, your spoken agreement. Then I'll be there, she said. He looked at her. The candle guttered. The kitchen went almost dark. You came here with nothing, he said. And you've faced more in 6 days than most mortals navigate in a lifetime. Something in his voice had shifted. Not softer. She would not have called it soft, but honest in a way that cost him something real. Are you not afraid? Elara considered this genuinely. I'm terrified, she said. But I've been terrified quietly in a house where no one cared for so long that this, she gestured at the sutured wound, the cellar. The Dawn water vials still in her pocket. This at least feels like being terrified for something that matters. The last inch of candle surrendered. In the dark, she heard him breathe. Chapter 9. The Rules of Old Things. Petra arrived at dawn. She came through the front door with the particular energy of someone who had been moving fast through cold streets for several hours, and had arrived to find the emergency already managed, which produced in her a complicated expression that Elara, watching from the kitchen doorway, catalogued as equal parts relief and professional irritation at having missed the engagement entirely. Petra was not what Alara had expected. Though she was beginning to understand that her expectations about Noctivayan were a series of assumptions steadily being corrected by reality. She had expected something like Casimir ancient, contained, severe. Petra was perhaps visibly 30, with close-cropped dark hair and quick amber eyes that moved through the entrance hall in 3 seconds and appeared to have mapped and assessed it completely. She was dressed practically, carried herself like someone who had decided long ago that the universe was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. And when she looked at Alara, her expression was direct and evaluating and not unkind. "You're the mortal," she said. "Alara Voss." Alara said, "I know who you are." Petra moved past her into the kitchen. Noted the sutured wound being addressed by Casimir with fresh linen. Noted the cellar door open. Noted the Dawn water vials empty on the counter. And assembled the story of the previous night with the speed of someone reading a language they were fluent in. "You fought in the cellar." "She designed the cellar," Casimir said, without looking up from his linen. Petra looked at Alara again. The evaluating expression adjusted slightly into something closer to interest. "How?" "The shelving," Alara said. "Channel formation. Limited their entry rate to 2 at a time." A pause. "That's good," Petra said, in the tone of someone who did not offer that assessment lightly. She poured herself something from the dark bottle on the counter. Alara had stopped trying to identify the contents of dark bottles in this house and sat at the kitchen table with the comfort of long familiarity. "How's the wound?" "Manageable," Casimir said. "He means it hurts considerably." Petra told Alara, "He has the pain tolerance of someone who has been catastrophically injured so many times that his baseline is calibrated wrong." She said this with the affectionate exasperation of someone who had been making this observation for a very long time to no effect. "How long have you been with House Casimir?" Alara asked. 212 years, Petra said. "I was 27 when I presented. Casimir found me in Prague, trying to understand why I had stopped needing to sleep, and had begun to find daylight genuinely unpleasant." A faint smile. "He explained things. Then he offered me a house or independence. I chose the house." She looked at Casimir. "He has an excellent explanation style. Very thorough. Slightly over-documented. I prefer precise," Casimir said. "You prefer control," Petra said pleasantly. "The documentation is a symptom." Alara watched this exchange, the centuries of familiarity beneath it. The particular ease of two people who had been honest with each other long enough that honesty had stopped requiring effort, and felt something loosen in her chest. Not loneliness, exactly. The recognition of its absence, here, in this kitchen, which was different. The days that followed the filing of the oath claim, which happened the morning after the cellar, in a gray stone building in the Accord quarter that looked like a notary's office and functioned as the closest thing to a court of law that the Noctivayan maintained, settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its texture. She had expected siege conditions, locked doors, whispered planning, the constant cold presence of threat, and those things were there. Casimir did not pretend they weren't. The threat was real, and Morvain's silence since the cellar had the quality of something gathering itself, but they existed alongside something else, something quieter and more unexpected. He began to teach her, not fighting, not tactics, though those came in practical increments as the days passed and the city outside continued its ordinary mortal routines beneath the extraordinary ones. He taught her the Accord, the lore, the deep history of the houses and the world they operated in, the one that ran parallel and adjacent to the mortal city, like a second river beneath the first, following the same geography but different laws. She brought the notebook every evening. He had stopped pretending to find this unnecessary. "The consent clauses," she said, on the 4th evening after the filing, sitting cross-legged in the high-backed chair, while he stood before the fire in his thinking posture. "Article 7 of the Accord. Walk me through the specific language." Article 7 states that no Noctivayan of any house affiliation may feed from a mortal without that mortal's spoken, uncoerced consent, given in full knowledge of the nature of the feeding. He had the article memorized, she had realized. The way some people had religious texts memorized not by study but by long proximity. The words absorbed into the structure of how he thought. Uncoerced is the operative word. Morvain's interpretation has historically been creative. Immortal in despair is, in their view, already consenting by virtue of diminished resistance. That's not consent, Alara said flatly. No, he agreed. It is not. Which is why Article 7 has an annotation added in the 1801 revision, which I also drafted specifying that psychological coercion constitutes the same violation as physical coercion. She wrote, 1801 revision. He wrote it. He's been building this scaffolding for centuries. Why? She said. He turned from the fire. Why what? Why do you care about the consent clauses specifically? You're Noctivean. You could feed without them. The clauses restrict you as much as anyone. He was quiet for a moment. The fire spoke. The October wind, which had been their constant companion since her first night, pressed at the shutters. I was 23 when I changed, he said. I told you that. He moved to his chair and sat all the way present. No partial retreat. In the years immediately following, before I understood what I was, before there were houses or a court or any structure at all, I made choices I cannot unmake. I fed from people who did not understand what was happening to them. He said it without evasion or self-pity, in the way of someone who has carried a thing long enough to know its precise weight. I understood afterward what those people had experienced, what had been taken from them without their knowledge. And you've been writing consent clauses ever since, she said quietly. Among other things, he looked at her. The lore that your literature prefers the vampire who takes, who controls, who bends mortal will to his own, that is not fiction entirely. There are Noctivean who choose that, who find the power of it easier than the restraint. His voice was even, but she could hear, beneath it, the old anger that lived in his foundations. I find it wrong, she said. Yes, he said. Simply wrong. She looked at this ancient, rule-building, bridge-patrolling man, and understood him, she thought, more completely than she had understood most people she had known for years. He had been wrong once, profoundly, irreversibly wrong, in the particular way that the very young are wrong, without malice and without understanding, and therefore without excuse. And he had spent 6 centuries, building a world where others would have the structural support to be less wrong than he had been. I want to show you something, she said. She crossed to the bookshelf, where she had relocated her notebook the previous day, and retrieved, from beside it, a small object, a dried flower, pressed between 2 pieces of card, which she had found that morning tucked inside the water-damaged oath record she'd been using as a reference. Small, pale, perfectly preserved, despite what must have been centuries. This was in the Covenant book, she said, bringing it to him. Page 43. Someone pressed it there deliberately. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Something moved in his face. Soren, he said. Not a question. Yes? She had a habit of pressing flowers and books. She said it was the most efficient way to preserve the perishable. Something almost gentle entered his expression. She was a botanist. Among other things, Alara held the flower out to him. He took it from her with enormous care, between the fingers, as though the pressure required precise calibration. You're teaching me old things, she said. The rules and the history and the architecture of how this world works. She watched him hold the flower. And you keep being surprised. When I learn them. Yes, he said. Why? He looked up from the flower. The fire behind her turned his eyes from garnet to something warmer. Something that had stopped maintaining the distance between the color it was and the color it could be. Because Soren was the last mortal who wanted to understand, he said. And before her, the one who wanted to understand was 300 years ago. He paused. I had begun to think it was the exception rather than the pattern. It should be the pattern, she said. Understanding things is how you stop being afraid of them. He looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of 600 years behind his eyes. And for once he did not close the window, did not retreat into the careful architecture of control. Yes, he said softly. That is exactly right. She sat with him in the firelight, and the flower rested on the arm of his chair between them. And outside, the city turned quietly toward November. And inside the house, something that had been waiting a very long time for the right conditions began, slowly and without ceremony, to grow. She taught him nothing grand, no revelation, no dramatic reversal of his ancient certainties. She simply said true things when she observed them, about the flower, about Soren, about what it meant to build rules as an act of penance versus building them as an act of hope, and she watched him receive each one, with the careful attention of something that had gone a very long time without being offered water. and had not quite believed the drought would end. 3 nights before the final confrontation, she fell asleep in the chair, and he did not wake her. And in the morning she found a blanket settled over her with the same precise, deliberate care as the tray of food on the first night. Small things. The architecture of warmth. She pressed her palm to the blanket and understood what it was. Chapter 10. The last law of the blood drive in Morvain came himself on the last night of October. Alara had known he would. Not from intelligence or strategy, though both had pointed toward it, but from the particular quality of the preceding 3 days, which had been too quiet in the way that weather is quiet before it stops being quiet permanently. The city had gone about its business with the ordinary innocence of people who did not know that the parallel river running beneath their streets was about to break its banks, and she had watched it from the sitting-room window each morning, with the understanding that whatever happened in the hours ahead would determine whether that innocence was preserved or became the most expensive thing the old quarter ever possessed. Casimir had told her about Riven in small, precise increments over the final days. 400 years old, head of a house that had always understood power as a resource to be extracted rather than a responsibility to be maintained. A mind that operated in the long game, not impulsive, not cruel for cruelty's sake, but capable of cruelty as a strategic instrument. With the serene efficiency of a physician selecting a scalpel, he arrived at 11 in the evening with 4 house members, which was a statement, not the skulking entry through a weakened ward that his soldiers had used, but the front door. 3 formal knocks, and when Casimir opened it, Riven Morvain, standing in the October dark like a man who had not yet decided whether he was here for a conversation or a conclusion, Alara saw him from the first-floor landing. Looking down, he was older seeming than Casimir, which she understood by now meant the opposite of what it appeared. Casimir's 6 centuries showed as severity and depth, while Riven's 4 centuries showed as a particular kind of refinement. The surface polished to such consistent smoothness that no truth could find purchase on it. He was dressed in formal house colors, dark gray and deep red, and he looked up the stairs and found her on the landing with the unsurprised expression of someone checking an expected variable. "Miss Voss," he said, pleasant, warm even, the warmth of a fireplace in a room with no exits. "You're looking considerably more alive than anticipated. The bridge had a structural failure," she said. "I survived it." A brief smile. "Indeed. Assisted, I understand." He looked at Casimir. The oath claim filing was a creative response. "Legal, I'll grant you." Accord compliant on its face, he stepped into the entrance hall without being invited, which was a violation she registered, and which Casimir registered with a stillness so complete it was louder than movement. But creative responses to legal instruments tend to invite creative interpretations of the same. "Come to the sitting room," Casimir said. Not an invitation, not quite a command. They went to the sitting room. Petra was already there, positioned with the casual precision of someone who had chosen that exact location for structural reasons and was wearing it as relaxation. Alara descended the stairs and took her place beside Casimir, not behind him, beside him, and felt him register it. That small sideways shift of attention that meant he had noted the position and accepted it. Riven settled in the chair that Alara privately considered Casimir's, which she understood immediately was deliberate. "The oath claim binds your house's safety to this mortal's life," Riven said, crossing one leg over the other with the ease of a man conducting a routine business meeting. "Blood weight provisions apply. You understand that this means any harm to her constitutes a direct accord violation on the part of the aggressor." He smiled. "Quite the commitment for a woman you've known for 2 weeks, 12 days. Casimir said, and yet, Riven's eyes moved to Alara with the assessing quality of someone pricing a piece of property. "I confess curiosity. What is it about a mortal wounded, family abandoned, of no particular political significance that compels the head of House Casimir to invoke blood weight on her behalf?" "The same thing," Casimir said, "that compels you to send 4 soldiers to collect her from a cellar. She's a witness." The room changed, small change. The quality of Riven's stillness shifting from social into something colder and more fundamental. She had expected denial. She watched him decide in real time, not to bother. "A witness to what precisely?" he said. "My brother," Alara said. Steady. She had practiced this, not the words, but the steadiness beneath them. Aldrich Voss, his business arrangements in the Eastern Quarter, the timeline of the railing's failure. She met Riven's eyes. Structural failures don't happen to specific sections of iron on specific nights at specific hours unless someone ensures they do. You have no proof, Riven said. Still pleasant. Still polished. I have a notebook, she said. And I have 12 days of education in accord law from the man who wrote most of it. She paused. Article 19. Conspiracy to deliver Immortal to unauthorized feeding constitutes a first-tier accord violation. Carries mandatory censure, territorial forfeiture, and a binding oath of non-aggression lasting no fewer than 100 years. She watched his face. I know because I asked about it specifically. 4 days ago. The fire crackled. Riven looked at her for a long moment. Then at Casimir. She memorized the articles, he said. She notices things. Casimir said, what happened next was not a siege. Elara had prepared for a siege. The Dawn water vials in her pockets. The iron rods she had finally learned to handle properly under Petra's 3 days of patient instruction. The geography of the room mapped and remapped until she knew every exit, every angle, every piece of furniture that could be weaponized or used as cover. She had prepared for the worst version. What Riven gave them instead was worse than the worst version, which was nothing at all. He stood, smoothed his jacket, looked at Elara with an expression that was almost admiring, in the way that a man who respects precision admits it when he encounters it in an unexpected place. You've filed the claim, he said to Casimir. You've documented the conspiracy theory and it is, for the record, a theory however well constructed. A pause. And you've educated your mortal in the precise articles that apply to my exposure. He smiled. And this time the warmth had entirely left it, and what remained was simply the structure of a smile, the shape without the temperature. Thoroughly done. The Accord authorities received a sealed copy of her documentation this morning, Petra said pleasantly from her corner. Along with a request for formal inquiry. Something moved through Riven's face. Fast. And then contained. The scalpel, she thought, briefly turned inward. You would trigger an inquiry, he said to Casimir. Which means Accord scrutiny on every house, including Casimir. Casimir has nothing to hide, Casimir said. We helped write the instrument. We have operated within it for 283 years. He looked at Riven steadily. Can you say the same? The room held this question for a long moment. Riven Morvain, 400 years old, head of the most aggressive expansionist house in Varenmore, looked at the ancient man who had been holding the line since before Riven's house had existed in its current form. Then he looked at the mortal woman beside him, small, dark-haired, holding herself with the particular composure of someone who had been made small for a very long time and had recently stopped cooperating with that project. Well, he said quietly, the crossing did find something interesting after all. He left. His house members followed. The front door closed. The sitting room expanded back into itself, the pressure releasing all at once. And Elara felt her legs make a quiet, democratic decision to sit down, which she executed by virtue of the nearest chair. Petra exhaled. He'll comply, she said. The inquiry threat is real, and he knows his documentation is exposed. He'll pull back, renegotiate the territorial terms, spend the next decade being ostentatiously Accord compliant. She sounded almost disappointed. It's what he did after the last censure. It buys time, Casimir said. Time for the other houses to align. For the Accord to be reinforced. He was looking at Elara. It is not a permanent resolution. Nothing is permanent, Elara said. Except, apparently you. Petra made a sound that was the most human thing Elara had heard from a Noctivean. She pressed her hand to her mouth and recovered quickly. But the sound had happened. Casimir looked at Elara. The window was open. It had been open since the wound, she thought, and he had stopped closing it with any real conviction. There is something I should say, he said. Then say it. He was quiet for a moment, choosing the words with the care he gave to all important things, not overly, not performatively, but with the genuine attention of someone who understood that language was the instrument of meaning, and meaning deserved proper tools. You came to this house with nothing, he said. And you leave it if you choose to leave it with every door open that was closed to you before. The oath claim can be converted to a formal house affiliation, if you want it. It can be dissolved, with full accord. Protections maintained for your safety, if you prefer independence. He met her eyes. There is also a third option, which I will name once and not press. She looked at him. I can begin the process of change, he said quietly. If you chose it. Willingly, fully informed, under the consent clauses I wrote myself, a pause. I will not ask twice. I will not ask again. It is your life, and the terms of it are yours entirely. The fire spoke. The November wind had replaced October outside, carrying the first edge of something colder. Alara thought about the bridge, the broken railing and the black water, and the moment before she fell, when she had not entirely minded the possibility. She thought about 12 days of being noticed, really noticed, not catalogued and managed and positioned, but seen by something 600 years old that had apparently been waiting, without knowing it, for someone willing to look back. She thought about mortality, about the finite shape of her life, its boundaries, its sweetness in direct proportion to its brevity. She thought about what it would mean to step outside that shape, and what she would carry with her, and what she would leave behind. Not yet, she said. He received this without reaction, that she could see, which she had learned to read correctly. But, she said, and watched his attention sharpen. I'm staying in the house, formally affiliated. Not as a protected mortal and not as a converted house member. She held his gaze steadily. As a partner. In the work, the accord, the consent clauses, the documentation. I'm good at noticing things, and I understand the articles now. And I'm not interested in being somewhere quiet. She paused. I'll revisit the third option when I've decided it's mine to make, not a response to a crisis. On my own terms, and in my own time. Casimir looked at her for a long moment. Partnership requires equal standing, he said carefully. I would need to adjust several things about how this house operates. I know, she said. I've been making a list. Petra made the sound again, and this time did not recover quickly. The corner of Casimir's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, and it was more than almost one. And she thought it was probably the rarest thing in that room, including the 6th-century-old man and the pressed flower still on the arm of his chair, and the October turned November. Air coming under the door. Show me the list, he said. She showed him the list. Outside. The old city went about its business. 4,000 people in the old quarter sleeping in the trust that the laws held. That the line had been held again. That the particular darkness running parallel to their ordinary lives had been kept. For another season. Within its banks. Inside. In the candlelit sitting room at the edge of the quarter. A woman who had jumped toward the dark and been caught by it, not consumed, not kept, but genuinely caught, sat beside the oldest thing she had ever known and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She began to write. He leaned, fractionally, to read over her shoulder. She let him. She came to him with nothing. She left when she chose to leave with everything that had always been hers. He had been holding the line for 283 years. She simply helped him hold it better. And in the space between the bridge and the house, and the fire and the flood of it all, something that had no name in any of the 8 accord treaties was written, quietly and without ceremony, into the oldest book either of them had ever kept. Some things are more permanent than permanence. Some things are worth the waiting.